Throughout history, some of the most chilling crimes have been committed not just by men, but also by women, and subsequently, they have been executed in some of the most crazy ways. From Risana Nafik, a young Sri Lankan maid in Saudi Arabia, beheaded for killing an infant, to Sachiko Ito, known as the drumstick killer, who was executed in Japan for her deadly exorcism rituals, here are stories in which justice prevailed in the form of some extreme executions. So let's start. Risana Nafik. Saudi Arabia is the only country that still uses an execution method not used anywhere else. That execution method brings us to Risana Nafik, a Sri Lankan woman who was convicted and subsequently executed in Saudi Arabia for the murder of 4-month-old Naif al-Kutaibi. Nafik was only 17 when she traveled to Saudi Arabia on May 4, 2005 to work as a housemaid. Her parents said her passport was changed to show she was born in 1982, making her seem older. This was to get around the rules in Sri Lanka that prevent anyone under 18 from working abroad. She found employment with a family in a place called Dawadmi. A few weeks later, on May 22, 2005, a tragic event unfolded. The baby she was caring for died. Although Nafik said the baby accidentally choked on milk from a bottle, the baby's parents and the police accused her of smothering the child after an argument with his mother. The authorities did not perform an autopsy to confirm how the baby died. Nafik reportedly signed a confession, but the Asian Human Rights Commission claimed she was forced to sign it without understanding it, as it was in Arabic, and she didn't have a translator when questioned. She was convicted and sentenced to death on June 16, 2007. The president of Sri Lanka even asked the king of Saudi Arabia to forgive her, but she was beheaded on January 9, 2013. Another woman was executed in the same country for a reason you'd find totally unexpected. Amina bint Abdul Halim bin Salam Nasser. In 2011, a Saudi woman in her 60s named Amina bint Abdul Halim bin Salam Nasser was executed for a crime that might seem unusual. She was convicted of practicing sorcery, which is banned in Saudi Arabia. The authorities accused her of deceiving people into giving her money by claiming she could cure their illnesses. Reports suggest she charged up to $800 per session for her services. Despite this, it's interesting to note that witchcraft and sorcery are not explicitly listed as crimes under Saudi law. However, Saudi Arabia enforces the death penalty for several other crimes, including rape, murder, apostasy, armed robbery, and drug trafficking. This case of sorcery is not isolated. For instance, in 2007, an Egyptian man was also executed in Saudi Arabia, accused of casting spells to break up a married couple. Amnesty International has pointed out concerns regarding the legal processes in such cases. Many of those executed reportedly had no defense lawyer and were not fully informed about the legal proceedings against them. The following female inmate had her story adapted into a movie with Charlize Theron portraying her character, Aileen Wuornos. While female serial killers are less common than their male counterparts, Aileen Wuornos stands out as being just as ruthless in her crimes. Between 1989 and 1990, she robbed and killed 7 men while working as a sex worker. Wuornos was a troubled individual whose early life was filled with hardship and abuse, which played a significant role in her later actions. Wuornos was arrested and, after a trial, was found guilty of multiple murders. She claimed that she acted in self-defense, stating that her victims had either raped or tried to rape her while she was working as a sex worker. However, the courts did not accept her defense, and she was sentenced to death. She spent over a decade on death row in Florida before her execution by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Her life and crimes later became the subject of various books, documentaries, and a 2003 movie titled Monster. In the film, actress Charlize Theron played Wuornos, earning widespread acclaim for her transformation and deep portrayal of the complex, troubled woman. Next up is a female criminal who became the second-to-last French woman to be guillotined, Meline Muton. Known as the Berthelot poisoner, Meline Muton was a French serial killer who poisoned 11 people in Sidi Bel Abbès, Algeria in 1943, 7 of which were fatal. By 1943, several people in Berthelot, where she resided, died under suspicious circumstances, such as showing signs of poisoning. This drew attention to Meline. Even her own child and several others, including her husband, showed similar symptoms but survived. Her actions eventually prompted an investigation by the Mobile Gendarmerie by late 1943. Investigation revealed that Muton had bought 200 grams of sodium arsenite from a local druggist, which she claimed was to get rid of ants. She was arrested and confessed to the fatal poisonings. Her trial began on November 15, 1947, and she was found guilty by the jury on all counts just 2 days later. She was executed on April 10, 1948, with the use of guillotine. Her skirt was adjusted to not interfere with the guillotine's blade. Her hair was pulled back, and her blouse was tucked tightly. As she was positioned on the guillotine, she began screaming for her children. Moments later, she was beheaded. Next up is a female serial killer who became the second of only 4 women to be executed in the California gas chamber, Louise Pete. A notorious female serial killer in American criminal history, Louise Pete was infamous for her charm and manipulative skills, which she used to lethal effect. Her criminal activities spanned over 3 decades. Beginning in the early 1900s, Pete's first known crime involved the murder of Jacob C. Denton, a wealthy mining engineer, in 1920 in Los Angeles. Denton was a widower with a teenage daughter who had made millions as a mining engineer before retiring. He disappeared into thin air, and after several months, his decomposed body was found buried in his own home. Pete claimed that Denton had gone to Europe, but evidence, including her possession of some of Denton's property, led to her arrest. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, but remarkably, she was paroled in 1939 after serving 18 years. Not long after her release, Pete befriended a financially stable elderly couple, Margaret and Arthur Logan. In a disturbing repeat of her past, Margaret Logan eventually went missing. In 1944, her body was discovered buried on her own property. Once again, Pete was found guilty of murder. This time, there was no parole. Louise Pete was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison in California on April 11, 1947. Her repeated pattern of befriending, then killing, and ultimately benefiting from her victims' deaths marked her as one of the most cold-hearted serial killers of her time. Moving on, the next female serial killer was executed for her exorcism murders in Japan, Sachiko Ito. Infamously dubbed the drumstick killer, Sachiko Ito was a Japanese serial killer convicted of 6 murders, which occurred between 1994 and 1995. A self-professed guru who claimed to have psychic abilities, she killed several of her cult members during bizarre rituals involving taiko sticks. The victims were individuals who had come to her seeking spiritual healing. She conducted her deadly assaults during what were supposed to be exorcism sessions. These sessions turned lethal when she and several accomplices restrained the victims, beating them with drumsticks and other objects under the guise of driving out evil spirits. Between December 1994 and June 1995, Sachiko Ito and her followers, which included her daughter Yuko, Hiroshi Namoto, and Mitsuo Sakina, participated in the killings. And then on July 5th, after one of the cult members was hospitalized, the Fukushima Prefectural Police decided to investigate Ito's residence. There, they discovered 6 decaying bodies and subsequently arrested Sachiko Ito along with her 3 accomplices. Additionally, the injured cult member was also arrested after it was revealed that she had taken part in the assaults. All of Ito's accomplices received prison sentences ranging between 18 years and life. She received a death sentence, and on September 27, 2012, when she was 65 years old, Sachiko Ito's sentence was carried out and she was put to death by hanging after several unsuccessful appeals. Next up is the only identified and convicted female serial killer from Iran, Mahin Kadiri. Located about 95 miles northwest of Tehran in the city of Qazvin, Iran, Mahin Kadiri emerged as a sinister figure. Struggling with mounting debts and lacking a regular income, Kadiri resorted to preying on elderly people, stealing their valuables to sell. Her series of crimes began in 2006 when she murdered an elderly man by strangulation during a robbery. She was caught and charged with murder, but was acquitted due to lack of conclusive evidence. For the next 3 years, Kadiri stayed out of trouble with the law, avoiding any violent crimes. However, in early 2009, she began a spree of murders that lasted until May. She used her yellow Renault car to drive around religious shrines in Qazvin, looking for elderly women wearing gold jewelry. She would gain their trust by offering them a ride, often complimenting them and striking up friendly conversations. During these rides, Kadiri would offer her victims a drink laced with an anesthetic, which incapacitated them, making it easier for her to strangle them with her headscarf or hands. This grim pattern continued until May 11, 2009, when she offered a ride to a 60-year-old woman. This woman grew suspicious when Kadiri drove off the intended route and refused the drink. Sensing danger, she demanded to be let out and later contacted the police with a description of Kadiri's car. This led the police to launch a massive search, checking over 27,000 cars across the region. They eventually traced a cream-colored Renault seen at one of the crime scenes back to Kadiri, leading to her arrest on May 15th. During her arrest, Kadiri confessed to all 6 murders, explaining that she committed them out of financial desperation and to pay for her daughter's medical expenses. She expressed a sense of relief upon being caught. Kadiri was tried and found guilty of 6 counts of premeditated murder. She was sentenced to death and was executed by hanging at Qazvin Central Prison on December 20th, 2010. The next craziest female execution entry is also the first female serial killer of South Korea, Kim Sunja. To those who knew her, Kim Sunja was a typical housewife and a mother of 3. Yet beneath this facade, she harbored a sinister side that led her to become one of South Korea's most notorious killers. Driven by financial financial greed exacerbated by a gambling addiction, Kim masterminded the murder of 5 individuals, including 3 of her own family members. Remarkably, she carried out these killings in public settings without ever physically contacting her victims, making her methods both cunning and horrifically effective. Kim's desperate need for money to support her gambling habit led her to continuously borrow and mishandle her finances. As her financial situation worsened, she resorted to murder to resolve her debts. Among her victims were a 49-year-old friend, a 50-year-old creditor, her own 46-year-old sister from whom she had borrowed 10 million won, and a cousin who had lent her a substantial 484 million won. Despite the mysterious circumstances surrounding these deaths, the police were initially slow to connect the dots, partly because autopsies were culturally taboo in Korea. Many believed that performing an autopsy was akin to harming the deceased again. This belief allowed Kim to evade suspicion for some time. Eventually, some autopsies were conducted on earlier victims, revealing similar causes of death. After her father's death, whom she had quickly cremated, cyanide testing became impossible. On September 2, 1988, Kim was finally arrested on murder charges. During a search of her home, authorities found items belonging to the deceased, including a diamond ring and cash. Further investigation led to her conviction as the police found cyanide in her bathroom. In 1989, the Supreme Court of Korea sentenced Kim to death. She was executed by hanging along with 22 others on December 30, 1997, marking the first set of executions since 1995 when 19 inmates faced a similar fate. Cyanide is extremely lethal, but so is arsenic, and that's what the next female serial killer used to murder people around her, Velma Barfield. A chilling figure in American criminal history, Velma Barfield is known for her deadly crimes and subsequent execution. Initially convicted of murdering 1 person, Barfield later admitted to killing a total of 6 individuals. Her method of choice was arsenic, which she used to murder her victims quietly and without immediate suspicion. Barfield's crime spree began in the late 1970s when she poisoned her 55-year-old mother using a lethal dose of arsenic. Her mother's death was initially attributed to natural causes, but suspicion grew when several other people in Barfield's life began to die under similar mysterious circumstances. These victims included her fiancé, a neighbor, and 2 other acquaintances, all of whom fell ill and died after coming into contact with her. Her method was both insidious and effective. She would secretly administer poison to her victims, often through food or drink. This made it difficult for authorities to immediately link the deaths to her. Over time, however, the pattern became clear. Velma Barfield was executed on November 2, 1984, by lethal injection. Barfield was the first woman in the United States to be executed after the resumption of capital punishment in 1976, and she was also the first woman executed since 1962. Additionally, she was the first woman to be executed by lethal injection. Coming up is another cold-hearted female serial killer who got the well-deserved execution, and that was not by lethal injection or hanging: Judy Buenoano. Known as the Black Widow, Judy Buenoano used arsenic to murder those closest to her. Her first victim was James Goodyear, a sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, who died on September 16, 1971 in Orlando, Florida. Although his death was initially thought to be from natural causes, it set a troubling precedent. In 1973, Buenoano moved in with Bobby Joe Morris from Trinidad, Colorado, and he too fell victim to poison in January 1978. Later, her son Michael became seriously ill, showing symptoms like paraplegia. On May 13, 1980, Buenoano took Michael out in a canoe which capsized. Weighed down by his braces and without a life jacket, Michael drowned, and it didn't take long before Buenoano opened a beauty salon after her son's death. In 1983, while dating John Gentry, his car exploded in Pensacola, Florida, severely injuring him. As Gentry recovered, police discovered inconsistencies in Buenoano's past. They found that the vitamin pills she had given Gentry contained arsenic and paraformaldehyde. Exhumations of her previous victims, Michael, James Goodyear, and Bobby Joe Morris, revealed they had all been poisoned with arsenic. Interestingly, Buenoano had collected hefty life insurance payouts from these deaths. Arrested in 1983, Buenoano was convicted in 1984 for murdering her son and attempting to kill Gentry, receiving a 12-year sentence for the latter and a life sentence for her son's death. In 1985, she was also found guilty of her first husband's murder and sentenced to death. And then on March 30, 1998, she was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Her last meal included steamed broccoli, asparagus, strawberries, tomato wedges, hot tea, and lemon. Now let's move to someone who was not a serial killer, and yet she was responsible for many deaths. Antonina Makarova. Known as Tonka the Machine Gun Girl, Antonina Makarova was a Soviet war criminal and executioner who collaborated with Nazi Germany during World War II. Born in the Soviet Union, Makarova found herself caught in the complexities of war when she was separated from her unit during the chaos of the German invasion. During 1942 to 1943, instead of being a prisoner, Makarova chose to collaborate with the occupying German forces. She served as an executioner at the Lokot Autonomy, a region controlled by the Nazis. Her role was particularly gruesome. She operated a Russian M1910 Maxim machine gun and was responsible for the execution of hundreds of Soviet partisans and their families. These victims were often partisans who were actively resisting the Nazi occupation, making her actions a direct betrayal to her fellow countrymen. Usually, Makarova was ordered to execute groups of 27 people at a time, which was the number of prisoners the local jailhouse could hold. Makarova's betrayal was not discovered immediately after the war. She lived under a different name, married, and started a family. However, her past eventually caught up with her when she was recognized by a former Lokot resident in the late 1970s. After her identity was confirmed, she was arrested, tried, and found guilty of her war crimes. Antonina Makarova was executed in 1979, marking a delayed but resolute response by the Soviet justice system to address the betrayals of collaborators like her. The following female serial killer who got the well-deserved execution worked with his partner to kill numerous people between 1947 and 1949. Martha Beck. Martha Beck was one half of the infamous Lonely Hearts Killers duo, alongside her partner, Raymond Martinez Fernandez. Their gruesome killing spree, which lasted from 1947 to 1949, claimed the lives of up to 20 victims across the United States. Beck and Fernandez met their victims through Lonely Hearts ads, exploiting the vulnerability of those seeking love and companionship. Martha Beck played a critical role in the pair's deadly scheme. She would pose as Fernandez's sister to allay the suspicions of their targets. Beck often deceived her victims by claiming she lived alone, presenting Fernandez as merely a guest who was her brother. Driven by intense jealousy, she took extreme measures to ensure that Fernandez and his supposed fiancés never engaged in intimate relations. Whenever he did become sexually involved with a woman, both would face the wrath of Beck's violent temper. Once the couple gained the trust of their victims, the duo would rob them, leading to murder to cover their tracks, or whenever they felt their scheme was at risk of exposure. Their victims varied in age and background, but they were predominantly women who were deceived into believing Fernandez would marry them. The murderous couple was eventually captured, and their trial attracted widespread media attention, highlighting the brutal nature of their crimes. In 1951, both Beck and Fernandez were executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in New York. The following entry revolves around a Hungarian necrophiliac serial killer, Piroska Jango Ladani. Regarded as one of the most infamous and insidious killers in Hungarian criminal history, Piroska Jango Ladani had already murdered 5 young ladies and children before she was a full adult herself. Her first murder was of 11-year-old Marika Komaromi, who herded cows in the city's outskirts. She lured the girl to her house by promising to give her some fries to eat. Once inside the house, she strangled her from behind with an electric wire. She then undressed the corpse and then rubbed herself against it. Afterwards, she covered it up with a blanket and dragged it out of the house to dump in a well. Similarly, she killed another 13-year-old girl who was selling chickens. She strangled her with a wire and then did some unthinkable acts with the body that even I cannot describe here. Between 1953 and 1954, she killed 5 teenage girls to satisfy her sexual urges. She was caught after her 6th attempt failed, and her victim went to the police. She was arrested, and the 20-year-old made a series of confessions, and on the 12th of December 1954, Piroska Jango Ladani was hanged in Solnock prison. Up next is a female serial killer who got the execution that was appropriate for such an evil person. Marianne Cotton. One of Britain's most infamous serial killers, Marianne Cotton used arsenic to kill those closest to her. Throughout her life, she is believed to have murdered 11 of her 13 children and 3 of her 4 husbands, making her story one of the most chilling in criminal history. Cotton's method involved poisoning her victims with arsenic, a common but deadly substance, which allowed her to kill undetected for some time. She typically administered the poison through food or tea, leading to the painful and prolonged illness of her victims before their deaths. Her motives were primarily financial, benefiting from the insurance payouts and other financial gains following the deaths of her family members. Her murderous spree finally came to an end when she was arrested and convicted for the murder of her stepson. Marianne Cotton was executed at Durham County Jail on March 24, 1873, under the hand of William Calcraft, a well-known executioner of the time. Typically, a hanging would cause instant death by snapping the neck, but in Cotton's case, she died by strangulation. This unusually prolonged and painful death occurred because the rope was set too short, which prevented the drop stop from breaking her neck as intended. The following female serial killer is the second woman to have been hanged in South African criminal history, Daisy de Melker. In a chilling chapter of South African criminal history, Daisy de Melker became infamous for her deadly manipulation of those closest to her. She was accused of using strychnine to poison two of her husbands, motivated by the prospect of collecting their life insurance money. Despite the severity of these accusations, her convictions would come from another, even more heart-rending crime. The only charge that led to her conviction was the poisoning of her only son, whom she killed using arsenic. After killing her first two husbands, Daisy de Melker married Sidney Clarence de Melker, a widower and plumber like her previous husbands. And in February 1932, Daisy traveled to Turfentine and purchased arsenic under the pretext of needing it to euthanize a sick cat. Shortly after, on March 2nd, her 20-year-old son Rhodes fell ill after drinking coffee she had prepared, as did his co-worker James Webster. Webster recovered, but Rhodes died on March 5th, initially believed to be from cerebral malaria. After his death, Daisy collected money from his life insurance. 1 week later, de Melker was arrested and charged with the murders of all three men. The Turfentine chemist from whom she had bought the arsenic that killed her son contacted police after he recognized de Melker from a newspaper photograph. After a trial that lasted about 1 month, de Melker was condemned to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on the morning of the 30th of December 1932 at Pretoria Central Prison. Next is the last woman that was beheaded in Norway, Sophie Johannesdottir. A Swedish-Norwegian serial killer, Sophie Johannesdottir worked as a maid for a merchant in Fredrikshald, now known as Halden, Norway. This is where she committed a series of poisonings between 1869 and 1874. She had a reputation for being difficult to work with, causing many other servants to quit. She was also known for stealing when unsupervised. Her first poisoning occurred in 1869, following a dispute with another maid who died suddenly from arsenic poisoning. Her pattern continued, and in 1872, she poisoned the merchant's wife with whom she was employed. 2 years later, after being caught stealing, she poisoned the merchant himself. The poisonings went undetected until 1875, when suspicions led to the exhumation of the merchant and his wife, revealing high levels of arsenic. Further investigation uncovered letters from Johannesdottir requesting arsenic from her sister, allegedly for a skin condition. Once confronted with the evidence and the bodies, Johannesdottir confessed to all three murders. She was found guilty in July 1875 and subsequently executed by beheading in February 1876. The following serial killer deserved the execution for killing her entire family: Martha Needle. Considered one of Australia's worst female killers, Martha Needle was everything but a loving mother and devoted housewife. She was responsible for carefully and systematically poisoning her entire family for insurance money. Martha Needle became infamously known as the Black Widow after she poisoned her husband, 3 young daughters, and her new fiancé's brother. Needle administered the poison gradually, maintaining a facade of devotion as her family members suffered and ultimately died. Her notorious case captured global attention when she was tried in 1894, turning her into a widely recognized figure. The turning point in catching Needle came when she attempted to poison Herman, the brother of one of her boyfriends. Dr. Boyd, who had grown suspicious, alerted the police. In response, the police devised a plan where they asked Herman to invite Needle to prepare lunch. During the meal, Herman signaled the detectives by blowing a whistle after Needle served him a cup of tea laced with a lethal dose of arsenic, enough to kill 5 people. The detectives intervened just as Needle tried to force Herman to spill the tea, thereby preserving the evidence of her attempt to murder him. Charged with attempted murder, Needle's trial lasted 3 days. Despite her plea of not guilty, she was convicted and sentenced to death. Martha Needle was executed on October 22, 1894. The following entry doesn't include one female serial killer. Instead, it was a group of serial killers that had 2 women, Rya and Sakina. How often do you get to see sibling serial killers? Well, Rya and Sakina were Egypt's most infamous serial killers. What makes their crimes more shocking is that they committed the killings with their husbands and 2 other men. Overall, the group killed over 17 women in the Laban neighborhood of Alexandria in 1919. Their victims were often prostitutes from the brothel they managed. The group lured women into one of their homes, where they would intoxicate them with wine and liquor. Once vulnerable, the 4 men restrained and suffocated the victims with a wet cloth over their mouths. They then robbed the women of their jewelry, money, and clothes. The bodies were buried beneath the floor tiles, which they would remove to dig a grave before carefully resetting them. Interestingly, Rya and Sakina operated right next to the El Laban Police Department, where they buried the bodies. During the time these women and girls went missing. Eventually, the authorities caught up with them, and following an investigation, Rya, Sakina, and their husbands were tried for murder. They were all convicted and sentenced to death on May 16, 1921. Next is another heartless woman who killed her entire family and got executed: Sarah Whitling. The story of Sarah Whitling marks a grim chapter in the history of Philadelphia County as she became the first woman to be executed there. In 1888, within a mere 3-month span, Whitling poisoned her husband and 2 children. Whitling's motives remain partly speculative, but are believed to involve financial distress or mental instability. She administered poison to her family members discreetly, resulting in their gradual deterioration and eventual deaths. The case came to light after the suspicious death patterns were noticed, leading to an investigation that focused closely on her actions. After the deaths of her children and husband, an autopsy and further investigation revealed the presence of poison, directly linking Whitling to the murders. The evidence gathered was compelling enough to lead to her arrest and subsequent trial. Despite her defense, the court found her guilty of multiple counts of murder. Whitling's trial was a significant event, drawing considerable media coverage and public scrutiny. She was found guilty and executed by hanging in 1889, the last entry on the list of a woman serial killer who referred to arsenic as her truest friend. Anna Maria Zwinziger. Arsenic, a deadly poison often used in the 19th century, is notorious for its ability to kill slowly and painfully. When ingested, arsenic disrupts the body's metabolic processes, causing severe symptoms like abdominal pain, vomiting, and eventually organ failure. Anna Maria Zwinziger took advantage of arsenic's stealthy effects between 1801 and 1811, using it to murder 4 people. Zwinziger, who considered arsenic her truest friend, was methodical in her killings. After being employed as a housekeeper at the home of several judges in Germany, she would poison her employers with arsenic and then nurse them back to health to gain their favor. Though she poisoned several people, 4 couldn't recover and died, one of whom was a baby. Zwinziger's deadly spree was driven by various motives, including personal grievances and financial gain. She managed to evade detection until a pattern emerged, leading to an investigation. Arsenic was found in the bodies of her victims. Zwinziger was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Before her beheading, she remarked that her execution might be a blessing in disguise, saying, "It is perhaps better for the community that I should die, as it would be impossible for me to give up the practice of poisoning people." Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, check out the suggested content on your screen by clicking one of the cards displayed.